you are ready to start the session. Have a good one.
Thank you. All right, welcome everyone for the session Encryption++ for Crypto 2021. As you probably know, we will have 5 short talks, around 5 minutes each, and then 25 minutes of Q&A session, where you can ask a question via the Zulip chat, whose link is going to show up, or directly on Zoom by raising your hand. Okay, so the first talk we will hear in this session is by Wei-Tek Wee, and he will be talking about broadcast encryption with size n to the 1/3 and more from K-Lin.
All right, can everyone hear me? Okay, yes. So I'll be talking about broadcast encryption. So let me start by defining broadcast encryption. In broadcast encryption, the sender and end users, and the sender wants to send a encrypted message to a subset of these users, so that any user in the set will be able to decrypt the message with that individual secret key. And in addition, any user outside the set should learn nothing whatsoever about the message, even if they collude. So our goal in broadcast encryption is to obtain broadcast encryption schemes with short parameters, which are short public key size, short ciphertext size, and short secret keys. Right, so what's known about broadcast encryption? So there's actually a very simple construction of broadcast encryption schemes from any public key encryption schemes that achieve linear size parameters, where linear here means linear to the number of users n. And in 2005, Bodin, Gentry, and Waters gave the first broadcast encryption scheme with sublinear size square root n size parameters. The construction relies on pairings. And since this 2005 work, a big open problem in both pairing-based crypto and broadcast encryption is to go below this square root n barrier. And in 2015, we showed that it's unlikely that we can beat this square root n bounds using pairings. At least we showed that this square root n is optimal for a large class of pairing-based schemes. So it's only last year that we have the first improvement to this square root n construction from standard assumptions, namely the work of Agrawa and Yamada, giving a polylog n scheme, assuming pairings, and additionally the LW assumption. So our main result in this work is a different way to go below square root n. Namely, we give the first pairing-based broadcast encryption scheme where the total parameter size is n to the 1/3. In particular, this n to the 1/3 beats our previous lower bound of square root n. Our construction achieves adaptive security under the bilateral K-Lin assumption. I want to emphasize here that prior to this work, even achieving selective security in the generic model with n to the 1/3 size parameters was not known. So the main crucial conceptual insight in this work that allows us to beat the previous square root n lower bound is the use of quadratic reconstruction. This is an idea first introduced in joint work with Liu and Nathan in the context of information-directed secret sharing. And to implement this framework, we will also rely on additional ideas from the literature on functional encryption for degree 2 polynomials. Our result for broadcast encryption is actually a special case of a more general result, namely cp-abe for degree 3 polynomials that achieves optimal parameter size. Namely, the total parameter size depends only on the number of variables in the polynomial, which we call it the n. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on the cp-abe scheme for degree 3 polynomials. Let me give a quick recap of what cp-abe is. In cp-abe, ciphertexts are associated with function f, and secret keys with input x to the function f. And decryption should be possible when f of x is not equal to 0, and security should hold when f of x is 0, even with collusions. So in this work, we're going to be looking at degree 3 polynomials, which we're going to specify by thinking of the input as 3 vectors of length n over zp, and the function, namely the polynomial, is specified by coefficient vector, which is length n cubed. And as a warm-up towards this construction, our construction for degree 3 polynomials will also be looking at degree 2 polynomials, where the coefficient vector is length n squared. So our starting point is a cp-abe scheme for degree 2 polynomials that achieve optimal parameter size. So total parameter size is n, linear n, namely the number of variables that are the input to this degree 2 polynomial. In this construction, in the cp-abe for degree 2 polynomials, the master public key contains 2 vectors of length n, W1, W2, that's encoded in the first group G1, and alpha, which is scalar, and you can think of this as a master secret key, which is encoded in the target group. For this overview, it's sufficient to just look at the first part, the first component of the ciphertext, and the first component of the secret key, which looks basically what's shown on the slide. And what we want to do is to start from the cp-abe for degree 2 polynomials and get to cp-abe for degree 3 polynomials. So a very natural thing to do is to take this scheme and replace x2 by x2 times x3. And once you make this change, a very natural thing to do next is to replace the vector w2 with the tensor of w2 and w3, where w3 is a random vector of length n that's also chosen by the set algorithm. Now, once you make this change, you get the following cp-abe scheme for degree 3 polynomials, where your ciphertext still has linear size as before, but your secret key now has quadratic size because of the x2 tensor x3 or the w2 tensor w2 tensor w3. So the first thing we're going to do is to get the secret key size down to all the n group elements by basically showing how to compute this vector of length n squared using just n group elements. So starting point would be to publish in the secret key an alpha encryption of x3 times alpha. And this is the idea that comes from FE for degree 2 polynomials. And once you have this term, the very natural way to try to compute that degree, the n squared size expression is to tensor this term with x2. You get a bunch of extra cross terms, which turns out you can cancel out by publishing just a linear number of group elements, namely the ones that you see on the slide. So once you do this, you get a cp-abe scheme for degree 3 polynomials with linear ciphertext size and linear secret key size. But the problem, however, is that now we still have a quadratic size master public key. And our next idea is basically to reduce this public key size to n by essentially having the encryption algorithm pick the vector w3, so that we no longer, we can only, so that suffices to just publish w2 in the master public key. And this creates some additional problems because the key generation algorithm will no longer be able to compute the first term, which depends on w3, and we need a couple more modifications in this key. And that basically completes the overview. So to conclude, we present the first broadcast encryption and cp-abe from pairings that breaks this price code and barrier using this idea of quadratic reconstruction. And just want to say that there's still a bunch of very exciting open problems in broadcast encryption, both from pairings and from lattices. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I don't see any questions, so let's move on to the next talk. Which is going to be about fine-grained, secure, attribute-based encryption by Yu Wang, Yashin Pan, and Yu Chen. And Yu Wang is going to give the talk whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So hello everyone, I'm Yu Wang, I'm from UESTC. Our title is Fine-Grained Secure Attribute-Based Encryption. It's a joint work with Justin Pan and Yu Chen. So as you know, for standard cryptographic scheme, we usually require that the only party can run the scheme in polynomial time, and the scheme can be secure against polynomial time adversaries. By now, there have been a great deal of primitives that are secure against under various assumptions proposed, such as the one-way function factoring, discrete logarithm, DDH. But we don't know whether these assumptions hold. So it's desirable to, for example, design some primitive under no assumption or just some mild complexity worst case assumption. But it has turned out that this is quite difficult. So the fine-grained cryptography gives us a direction approaching this problem. In the fine-grained cryptography, we only require that the honest party uses less resources than the adversary, and the adversary, the resources of the adversary can be a prior bounded. So in this setting, it's possible to make the underlying assumption extremely weak. By now, there have been many fine-grained primitives proposed, such as key exchange, one-way function, PKE, verifiable computation, and hash proof system. But there are still many important primitives that are missed, such as signature. So in this work, we propose the first fine-grained secure AB scheme. Our scheme borrows the BKP framework by Blaise and others, which constructed IB from a FineMac, and also the CHW framework by Chen and others, which constructed AB from predicate encodings. So we first generalized the FineMac in the BKP framework by making use of part of the predicate encoding in the CHW framework, and then combine the generalized version of the FineMac with other parts of the predicate encoding to achieve the AB scheme. By instantiating the underlying predicate encoding in our generic construction, we can obtain an IB scheme, which in turn implies a signature scheme, and also many types of AB schemes, and also the broadcast encryption and fuzzy IB in the fine-grained setting. All of the instantiations are computable in AC02 and are secure against adversaries in NC1. Notice that AC02 is included in NC1, so the owner's party uses less resources than the adversaries. And the assumption is that NC1 is not equal to parity L/poly, and all the computations are over GF2. Notice that this assumption is widely believed to hold. And this setting is exactly the same as the bounded circuit setting in previous works on fine-grained cryptography. So our starting point is the BKP framework, which constructed IB from a FineMac. The FineMac was secure under the MDDH assumption. And the converging from the FineMac to the IB scheme heavily relies on the asymmetric pairing, and it's necessary to compute the inverse of a matrix in the security proof. But unfortunately, we don't have any pairing or MDD assumption in the NC1 world. And also we cannot compute the inverse of a matrix in NC1. So instead of making use of the MDDH assumption, we make use of a new hard subset membership problem proposed by Agashan and others. This hard problem holds if the complexity problem I mentioned before holds. And for the IB scheme, the crucial step in the security proof is to design a reduction algorithm which breaks the security of the FineMac. And to achieve this, we developed a new technique to extract the forgery of the FineMac from the adversary without computing the inverse of matrix, so that the reduction can be run in NC1. And we developed this technique by making use of several lemma in by Degwika and others, and also Agashan and others. And our construction essentially implemented a dual system without pairing in the fine-grained world. Also, we note that the construction essentially used encoding for equality. And by generalizing the encoding for equality as predicate encoding in the CHW framework, we can achieve the fine-grained AB scheme. Please see the paper for more details. And this is the conclusion of our work. And we want to mention that by making use of our technique, we can also achieve an efficient fine-grained Q-index scheme. So that's all. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next talk, which is going to be about multi-input quadratic functional encryption from pairings by Shweta Agrawal, Rishabh Goyal, Junichi Tomida, and Rishabh is going to give the talk.
You guys can hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Roman. Okay, so welcome everyone. Today I'm going to tell you more about how to build multi-input quadratic function encryption from pairings. So, wait a second, yeah. So the starting point of this talk is the notion of functional encryption. Functional encryption, as most of you might know, is a very powerful notion of encryption which allows fine-grained access over encrypted data. Suppose we have two parties, Alice and Bob, and Alice has some private sensitive data M over here, and Alice wants to share this data such that a different party, Charlie, only can learn f of n, the evaluation of function f on the message m, but nothing else about the message. So what Alice can do is that Alice can typically use the encryption algorithm to encrypt its sensitive data. And what function encryption allows us is that it says that Bob, which has the master key material, can generate a partial decryption key such that this partial decryption key for this function f can be used to sort of decrypt the ciphertext and learn only the evaluation of the function f on the message m. And it basically hides all the other information about the message m. And the intuition behind security of function encryption says that suppose I give you a ciphertext that encrypts a message m and polynomially many secret keys for different functions f1, f2 up till fq. Then you as an attacker can only learn the evaluation of the function f on the current message, but nothing else. So basically, you can only learn what you can learn by running the decryption algorithm honestly. Now, function encryption, as in the last decade, we've seen it's tremendously powerful and has tremendous amount of applications. But there's an interesting generalization of function encryption to the notion of multi-input function encryption. In multi-input function encryption, instead of having a single message source, we have multiple input sources. And now with all these multiple input sources, again, Charlie wants to learn the evaluation of function f that it chooses on all these messages together at the same time. And all these messages are independently encrypted under their corresponding encryption keys. A multi-input function encryption scheme says that Bob, again, using its master secret key, can generate a partial decryption key such that this partial decryption key can be used to learn exactly this value, f of m1, m2 up to mn, and nothing else about the underlying messages. And this can be formalized, this intuition can be formalized into a security argument where you basically say, suppose as an adversary, I give you a polynomially many ciphertext encrypting different messages and also give you a polynomially many secret keys. Then you as an attacker can only learn the information about the messages that you can learn by sort of picking and choosing different ciphertexts and running the decryption algorithm given your secret key, but nothing else. Here I'm sort of giving the intuition the secret key setting where I assume that the adversary cannot encrypt messages on its own. And it has to always query the challenger to sort of get these ciphertexts. Then you can also sort of define it in the public key setting where the adversary can encrypt messages on its own, but there will be more leakage in that setting because if the adversary can sort of just pick messages, then it can learn even more information about the encrypted messages. Now let's just look at the landscape of multi-input function encryption schemes that is around. So generally, we already know how to get multi-input function encryption schemes for general functions, like for all circuits, for Turing machines, etc. But it relies on very complicated assumptions like indistinguishability obfuscation, multi-linear maps, and so on. However, we also know that we can build multi-input function encryption schemes for specific functions such as linear functions, starting with very standard assumptions like assumptions over matrix EDH, learning with errors, quadratic reciprocity, and more. Now, if we look closely at the class of these specific functions, then we know that for these specific functions such as linear functions, we know we can build function encryption schemes in the one input case for linear functions from simple assumptions such as DDH, LW, and DCR. And we can also extend those ideas to sort of give us MIFE for that same function class, for the class of linear functions from same assumptions. And we also know that we can build function encryption for quadratic functions, but in the case of one input, one user, and we rely on pairings for that. An interesting question is that since in the linear function case, we can actually sort of extend this one input FE scheme to multi-input FE scheme, can we do the same for these quadratic functions as well? And this is precisely what we show in this work. We show that we can build a multi-input function encryption scheme for quadratic functions when we start with pairings. So let me just quickly explain what's the difference between single input and multi-input in this setting. So in a single input linear function case, suppose you have an input x, a vector, and a function c. And the output of the evaluation is basically the sort of evaluation, just inner product of this of the function and the input. Now, in the case of quadratic functions, you basically sort of have the input x and a function c, and the evaluation is going to be you basically create all the inner products between x between the input x, and you sort of do an inner product with the function c. Now, what happens in the single input case is that the quadratic functions, this class of quadratic functions, can actually be generically computed from single input linear functions. The idea is that instead of just encrypting the input x directly, you basically encrypt all possible pairs of the input pair, just all degree 2 functions of all degree 2 computations over the input x and under the linear function. And basically you can sort of instantiate a quadratic function encryption scheme from sort of linear functions by sort of using this idea. But the problem is that in this generic transformation, you sort of rely on the fact that you have to expand out the ciphertext space. So the ciphertext grows sort of quadratically with the size. And it becomes only interesting when the ciphertext size has to be small, has to only grow linearly with input length. Now, in the multi-input case, we again sort of can define for linear functions the same way. We have all these inputs, different vectors, and a function C would sort of evaluates an inner product between appending all these inputs together and taking the inner product with this vector C. Now, in the case of quadratic functions, we have sort of, we perform a tensoring operation to take the inner product or just a tensoring operation of all these inputs, create these degree two terms, and sort of just take the inner product with the function C. Now, as it turns out, in the multi-input case, a multi-input quadratic functional encryption scheme is not generically constructible from multi-input linear function encryption scheme. And this is precisely because of the cross terms. There are some cross terms of the form xi tensor xj, which were not present in the single input case. And because of that, quadratic MIFE cannot be generically obtained from linear MIFE, even if we don't care about the ciphertext size. And the question then becomes that even if we forget about the ciphertext size, can we sort of compute this functionality in the multi-input setting? And this is precisely what we show. So sort of there could be three scenarios where sort of we have this multi-input encryption scheme in which there is an encryption key for each user, or there's a single public key for all the users, or there's a master secret key that you need to perform the encryption algorithm. In this work, we show if you sort of work in this public key setting where the encryption algorithm takes from the public key, then this can be easily constructed from any linear function encryption scheme still. And we show that in the secret key setting, we can actually build this multi-input function encryption scheme for quadratic functions. And it's still open that whether we can build MIFE for this mixed corruption setting, generally for quadratic functions. Now, due to lack of time, I won't have enough time to tell you about how we actually design this, but let me just quickly share some sort of key ideas. So basically, the idea is that we sort of start with a function encryption scheme for linear functions, but that has to be a function hiding scheme. And the point is that a MIFE ciphertext, a quadratic MIFE ciphertext, is going to contain a linear FE secret key and a ciphertext, both of these things. And basically, you encode the input vector inside the secret key and the ciphertext for this linear FE schemes. And you also embed some masking parameters, masking terms. And the idea is going to be the MIFE secret key for the quadratic function. It's going to give you a linear FE secret key that can basically be combined with these masking terms and compute some unmasking terms. And you can sort of combine different components in different ciphertexts and sort of just pair them together and just sort of decrypt them across these different slots to learn the corresponding function value. And just to summarize, we sort of, in this work, we propose the first quadratic multi-input function encryption scheme from pairings, sort of closing, following on this intuition that we can actually use ideas in the single input setting to get quadratic setting or just a multi-input setting. And there are a lot of interesting questions in this area. We could only prove selective security of a constructor scheme, but can we actually prove adaptive security in the standard model for quadratic MIFE? Or can we actually improve the ciphertext size of our scheme? And finally, can we actually go beyond quadratic functions from standard assumptions and actually try to evaluate a much larger class of functions from standard assumptions? And with that, I'll just invite you to look at the longer version of the talk that Junichi gave, and it's like beautifully explains all our technical ideas and how we were able to sort of handle these masking and unmasking terms and still sort of prove security. With that, I'll sort of just conclude, and thanks for your time.
Thank you. All right, so let's move on to the next talk, which is going to be about functional encryption for Turing machines with dynamic bounded collisions from LWE by Shweta Agrawal, Shota Yamada, Monosish Maitra, Narasimha Zai Vempati. And Monosish is going to give the talk.
Can you hear me, Roman?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. Now I shared my slides, I think. Is it? Yeah, is it fine?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So, hi, everyone. Thanks. So, yeah, my name is Monosish Maitra, and I'm here to talk about functional encryption for Turing machines with dynamic bounded collusion from LWE. This is joint work with Shweta Agrawal and Narasimha Sai Vempati from IIT Madras and Shota Yamada from AIST Japan. So as we just saw in the last talk, key policy functional encryption, or more traditionally known as functional encryption, is a generalization of public key encryption in the sense that it gives secret keys tied to functions F that can be used to decrypt ciphertext to reveal the functions of plain text. On the other hand, security says that any PPT adversary, no PPT adversary should be able to learn information any more than what the functions of the plain text reveals. So this is more formally captured by the existence of a simulator in an ideal world, which should be able to simulate a ciphertext that is indistinguishable from the real world one, given access only to the length of the plain text and secret keys for, say, a bunch of Q functions, capital Q functions, and their outputs on the plain text. Now, this capital Q, when it is unbounded, we call this collusion resistant and or fully simulation secure. Unfortunately, this was shown to be impossible to attain for all circuits. Therefore, we can weaken this security setting to say that Q is a bounded polynomial where we declare it a priori before the setup. And we call this model traditional bounded collusion model, where we can still hope to achieve simulation-based security. Now, our work in this paper begins at this junction, where we try to address some limitations of prior work and try to overcome them as follows. So the first limitation comes from the bounded collusion model itself. This was first formalized and studied by Gorbunov et al. In 2012, and there were subsequent works being done till as recent as in 2019 by Anant and Vaikunthanathan. In this model, because Q is fixed at setup, this leads to an inefficiency that the keys and the ciphertext in the system grow with collusion-bound Q. And furthermore, however less or more sensitive the underlying plain texts are, all the ciphertexts in the scheme suffer or maybe, satisfy the same collusion tolerance. So in this context, we introduce this new, stronger notion of dynamic bounded collusion, where essentially the encryptor gets to fix the collusion bound per ciphertext as demanded by the sensitivity of the underlying plain text. And as a consequence, the runtime of the setup and key generation gets independent of the factor Q. And in our constructions also, the ciphertext size grows linearly with the choice of that particular Q. We show that functional encryption can be built in this stronger model generically from identity-based encryption. The next limitation is that we want to point out is that all prior work mostly build key policy AFI, focus mostly on building key policy AFI. On the other hand, to build the dual notion of ciphertext policy AFI, where you want to hide, let's say, a function inside a ciphertext and generate secret keys for public inputs, can be done via universal circuits. But this again, becomes inefficient, of course, because due to the use of universal circuits, and also they end up supporting bounded size circuits because of the fixed input length to the universal circuit. The only exception in this line of work is a scheme by SS10, which is a single key secure cp-abe scheme from public key encryption and garbage circuits. Now, in this context, we build a ciphertext policy AFI, which is dynamic bounded collusion secure with various trade-offs. We show that assuming indistinguishability-based CPA secure IBE, we can get non-adaptive simulation secure cp-abe for unbounded size circuits. However, to get adaptive simulation-based cp-abe, we need to rely on simulation-based receiver selective opening secure IBE, but at the cost of getting support for only bounded size circuits. Here, we note that it is worthwhile to note that SIM RSO is not a stronger assumption than in CPA. Therefore, in this regime, all our constructions can be based on the traditional in CPA security only. We also show that IBE is a necessary assumption to build functional encryption in with the stronger model, dynamic bounded collusion. Further, we show that we show how to build succinct functional encryption schemes from LWE, both in the ciphertext and key policy settings. This also strengthens a prior work. By the way, succinct here means circuits that are supported are of unbounded size, but of bounded and depth and output. But this also strengthens a prior work by Goldwasser et al., who built succinct key policy AFI from LWE, but only in the bounded collusion model, satisfying NSIM security. The third aspect of our work is to support more general models of computation, namely uniform, because owing to the inherent drawbacks that non-uniform models like circuits have. So in this regime, we have a public key AFI scheme by Goldwasser et al. For Turing machine, built from a non-standard assumption. There is another public key AFI for DFA as well as for finite DFA as well as Turing machines. From learning with errors by Agrawal and Singh, but that is only single key secure. And more recently, there is a FE for finite automata built from LWE by MY19, but it's a secret key FE. And last but not the least, all these are secure in the bounded collusion model. So here we built for the first time a public key FE scheme for the general class of Turing machines as well as the class of non-deterministic log space Turing machines from the learning with errors assumption. In more detail, we built both the key policy and ciphertext policy variants for FE for Turing machine, satisfying the stronger notion of DBC. In particular, the FE for Turing machine satisfies NSIM security, while that for NL satisfies adaptive simulation. And because NL, the class NL already captures finite automata, this subsumes prior work by MY19 and AS17. We note that the ciphertexts in our schemes grow with the runtime T. However, this T is not really a global bound and can vary per input chosen by the encryptor. So overall, we introduced this new model of dynamic bounded collusion FE, which is stronger than the traditional bounded collusion model. We build various functional encryption schemes in the ciphertext policy as well as the policy setting with various properties and with various security guarantees. We also for circuits as well as Turing machines. And further, we show that IB is a necessary assumption to build functional encryption schemes in this dynamic bounded collusion model. We note, however, here that there's a concurrent work by Garg et al., who also introduced this notion of DBC security, and they built functional encryption schemes in the key policy setting, satisfying this security notion. The techniques are also very similar to us. They use IB and existing KPFE schemes to compile their DBC secure KPFE generically. And finally, I would like to end with some open problems. Here the FE for Turing machine satisfies non-adaptive simulation security. So AdSim security is a nice open question. How to get it? We don't know. Also, there is a runtime dependence on the ciphertext, which we would like to get rid of altogether. Also, we saw that we observed that our compiler can actually yield collusion-resistant AV for Turing machine if only we know how to build cp-abe for unbounded depth circuits. So this is only the kind of the missing piece in our compiler, but we don't know how to support cp-abe for unbounded depth circuits from LWE. And yeah, last but not the least, there may be other applications for our techniques. And thanks for listening to this talk. The final, I would invite you to see the full talk as well as see the full paper. Thanks for listening again. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to the last talk of the session, which is going to be about receiver anonymity in re-randomizable RCCA secure crypto systems resolved by Yi Wang, Wangmao Chen, Youmin Yang, Yunyi Wang, Baosheng Wang, and Moti Yung. And Yi Wang is going to present the paper.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for introduction. Welcome to this talk about receiver-anonymity in randomizable RCCA secure crypto system. I'm Yi Wang, and this is a joint work with Rongmao Chen, Guomin Yang, Xinyi Huang, Baosheng Wang, and Moti Yang. Replayable CCA security was proposed by Canadian co-authors at Crypto 2003. It is the same as CCA security, except that the adversary is allowed to modify a ciphertext into a new one of same plain text. So it is a relaxation of CCA security. Such relaxation endows the PKE with desirable features. Randomizable RCCA security is one of them. We say PKE is randomizable if there exists an efficient algorithm rerand that takes as input public key PK and ciphertext C, and output a new ciphertext C prime of same public key and plain text. If the algorithm rerun does not need public key PK, we say this PKE is universally randomizable. Random RCCA security turns out to have many applications, such as mixed-stacked controlled malleable NIZK and cryptographic reverse firewalls. However, for some privacy-oriented applications, RCCA receiver anonymity is also required. The formal definition of RCCA receiver-anonymity was proposed by Prabhakar and Roslik at Crypto 2007. Roughly, the RCCA receiver-anonymity means that the adversary who can access a decryption oracle cannot obtain any information about the underlying public key from the ciphertext. Prabhakar and Roslik also said that ID anonymity brings out the power of randomizability and yields a potent cryptographic primitive. However, their scheme, the PR scheme, does not achieve this definition of anonymity. And how to construct a receiver anonymous rand RCCA PKE was left as an interesting open problem. So in this work, we provide the first receiver anonymous rand RCCA PKE based on the PR scheme and resolve this open problem. Then we provide a generic construction of receiver anonymous rand RCCA PKE based on the RE-SPHF. It is a new variant of SPHF. Also, we instantiated with the framework with k-linear assumption and the grid ring. Next, we show how to modify the PR scheme into an anonymous rand RCCA secure PKE. And this is the zeta is the ciphertext of the PR scheme. It consists of 4 strands. One can note that the first 2 strands, C1 and C2, their restriction is restricted by the mask U and the vector Z. So the blue arrows illustrate the only way to randomize the strand C1 and C2. However, there is no such restriction in C3 and C4. So the adversary is able to re-encrypt C3 and C4 with guessed public key and verify its guess via querying a decryption oracle. So this is why the PR scheme does not achieve receiver anonymity. So if we want to realize the anonymity, we have to disable all the randomization of C3 and C4 involving public key. So this is our treatment. We decide to move all the mask and vector to the validity checking part. And now the blue arrows illustrate the only way to randomize the ciphertext. And next, we show how to generalize our treatment using the SPHF. SPHF means smooth projective hash function. It was proposed by Kramer and Soup at Eurocrypto 2002. Roughly, it is a family of hash function that maps element set X onto the hash value set pi. Each SPHF is associated with a subset membership problem. And SPHF also can be generalized into the tag-based tag SPHF, where the tag tau is introduced as the auxiliary input of the hash function HSK. So in this work, we extended the SPHF with randomizability and proposed the notion of randomizable SPHF, RE-SPHF. In this SPHF, we introduced 3 extra algorithms to capture the randomization of elements, tag, and hash values. Also, we defined 4 new smoothnesses. And now our construction can be generalized using 6 different RE-SPHFs, and with the hardness of subset membership problem and the new smoothnesses, we can give a modular analysis of our of the RCCA security of our construction, as well as the RCCA receiver anonymity. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Before taking questions, let's give a round of applause virtually to all the speakers. Thank you. So now we have time for questions that you can post on the Zulip chat or just by raising your hand if you want. Okay, so I don't see anything on the Zulip. Perhaps I'm not using it correctly, but okay. I have some questions. So for the first speaker for WETEC, you mentioned, you described an encoding to build your broadcast encryption. And I understood that it's computationally secure because that has an L-gamma encryption, if I remember. Is this necessary to have a computational encoding? Could you do it statistically? Would that make overall broadcast encryption simpler?
Right. That's a good question. So it's actually a combinational encoding, and in fact, so basically our GKW lower bound applies only in the information theoretic setting and assuming linear reconstruction. So, one could actually avoid the lower bound either by moving to computational security or by moving to quadratic reconstruction. And either would have been sufficient to avoid the lower bound, and in this work we actually did both. So it's not clear that you really need the computational version of the encoding. That's correct. In fact, in the work with Bino and Tianren, we actually have a information theoretic encoding with degree 2 reconstruction, but the construction only works over fields of characteristic 2. So it crucially loses the fact that when you multiply some terms out, some terms appear twice. And if your field has characteristic 2, this cross terms are difficult to handle, cancel out. And we actually don't know how to extend that encoding to general fields, small p. So, and it's very conceivable that that's doable. So then that would potentially give a different construction. But I guess at least for broadcast encryption, it's sufficient to do the computational version. So that's what we ended up doing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Makes sense. Okay. I will unmute a few people that are raising their hands. I'm trying.
They can actually unmute themselves. You won't need to do it manually.
I think it worked. So I think Prabhanchan had a question or raised his hand.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, one for Monosich and one for Rishabh. My first question is, so regarding this, your point on the last slide about removing runtime dependence on the ciphertext size, is there some barrier for using like succinct garbling schemes to generically remove the runtime dependence on the time bound?
I'm not really sure about that, but in our compiler, it actually, the runtime became a factor because at the end, we used universal circuits where we had to run the Turing machine on the input X inside the circuit for some T number of steps. And because Turing machine, if you don't know a runtime bound, you cannot have the circuit size, you cannot know the circuit size beforehand, right? So essentially that became a bottleneck in our compiler actually. Why? That is because because of which we need to bound the runtime of the ciphertext. But I'm not sure if succinct garbling schemes here can
because you can garble the encryption algorithm, right? And the garbled Turing machine will not depend on the encryption complexity, right? You're sort of delegating or rather deferring the execution of encryption to the decryption phase.
Yeah. Yeah, I need to think about it in a bit more detail and can take your question offline. But yeah, I need to think about it in more detail.
Yeah, there's a reason I mentioned
garbling
schemes is also because maybe the implication might go the other way around as well. Like if you consider like FE for Turing machines, where the ciphertext size grows with does not grow with the runtime bound, maybe this already implies succinct garbling schemes.
Yeah, so that could be as well. Yes. Yeah.
Can I ask one more question to Rishabh, or should I circle back?
Yeah, sure. If it's is it a quick question?
Yeah.
Sure.
So so you construct MIFE for quadratic functions, right? And I would imagine constructing MIFE for like cubic functions would imply I/O, so you would need probably more assumptions. But can you construct something in between? Like Roma and others considered this notion of just like public NC1 evaluation and private like quadratic evaluation, right? Like, can you get the same result for MIFE as well?
I guess, yeah, possibly. It's a good question. So it's like that's possible. And I mean, I think a good starting point would be trying to optimize the ciphertext size. It's like the construction that we have. It's not, I mean, you don't need to sort of, the ciphertext size need not depend upon the total number of users or quadratically on the underlying sort of message length. And we still have that dependence. So it's though it's not generically implied in sort of multi-input cases for quadratic functions, but it's like still interesting trying to improve that part first. But yeah, if you can improve that, then maybe it's like there might be hope that, okay, maybe you can sort of, because right now, if you sort of have this public component of the FE evaluation, then we are sort of just blowing things up a little more, and that blow up might be a little more, and you might be able to do what you're trying to suggest, trying to have this public component of the computation. That might be possible, but it's like, it really depends whether that technique applies in the multi-input setting or not. Possibly, but not sure.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you. I think Rohit Chatterjee wanted to ask a question. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, sorry. I think I've been mostly preempted by Prabhanjan, but also as a follow-up to Rishabh, can you blow up your key size and do more than quadratic? Or are you locked into quadratic in many different ways?
Can't say for sure, but I would say we might be locked in into quadratic. Reason being, we do not have enough. I mean, we only have one pairing available, and we are sort of using the pairings available to us in a nice enough way. So even if we sort of blow up the key size, it's not the key size. The ciphertext size is being blown up, and the key size blow up is not the problem, because anyways, the key is always going to depend upon the length of the vector, the C vector. You have to have that information available. So the question, you're saying, okay, maybe if you blow it up by even more, it might happen that you might be able to reduce potentially the circuits or the ciphertext size, maybe. But if you're trying to ask whether you can sort of extend the function class, I'm not too sure. Intuitively, I don't see exactly why that will help. Might, but I can't say for sure.
Sure, idle thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike Roselek, if you want to ask a question.
Sure. I had a question for the last speaker, Yi Wang, if he's still here. So in our 2007 RCCA encryption scheme, we had this weird assumption about DDH in related groups. And I'm wondering if your DDH instantiation still has that strange feature, or if you're able to somehow get rid of that.
Yes. The group we has to use, we also has to be the coming chain. Yeah. Yes, we still has to obey that requirement.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Stanislaw Jarecki wanted to also ask questions.
Hi. It's also a question to the last speaker, Yi Wang. Maybe it's naive, but I'm not sure I understood the attack on the PR scheme and the model. So you said that the problem with this previous re-randomizable encryption was that attacker can pick a public key, randomize the ciphertext in a special way using that target public key, and then send the result to the decryption oracle and see if it's decrypted or not. But if your decryption oracle decrypts per public key, then if you have that decryption oracle, then everything is de-anonymized just by querying the decryption oracle, right? Because I can just ask, is this a valid ciphertext for a certain public key? And the decryption oracle will tell me yes, no. So I think I'm missing something from the security model.
Yes, a key point to achieve RCCA receiver-anonymity is that the adversary cannot re-encrypt the ciphertext with public key. So you can see the security game. If the adversary can re-encrypt the ciphertext with public key, it can guess the public key. It can guess the public key and re-encrypt part of the ciphertext, and then he can send the new ciphertext to the decryption oracle to verify its guess, because the decryption oracle would return replay if it is a valid ciphertext, and it would return about if there is a valid ciphertext. So it can distinguish, it can verify its guess via the output of the decryption oracle. So if we have to achieve receiver-anonymity, we have to make sure that the only valid way to randomize the ciphertext is not involving, does not involving the public key. So that is why in this slide, in our treatment, we have to disable all the randomization using the public key and the blue arrow.
So I think that the issue is like, what is this decryption oracle exactly? So you're assuming a decryption oracle that it doesn't decrypt anything. It just tells you a bit.
Yeah,
what does
the decryption oracle will decrypt the ciphertext using two different secret key.
In the game, you have only two public keys, right?
The challenger will provide two different public key to the adversary. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so the decryption oracle decrypts under the two keys, and
yes, the decryption oracle would decrypt the ciphertext using two secret key respectively. So if one of the decryption result equals to the challenge plaintext M star, so the oracle would return replay. Otherwise, it would return the decryption result honestly.
Okay. This is a subtle thing. So thank you so much for explaining that.
Thank you for your interest. Thank you for your question.
Right. I just have one last question. I guess there's nobody else asking question before we stop. Question to Yu Wang. Just you mentioned if he's still here. Yes. Okay. Yeah. You mentioned basically it's a very high level question. Do you know if these techniques that you came up with, basically you are reproducing the dual system methodology without pairing? So you mentioned ABE, NIZIC. Is there any other primitive, for example, functional encryption for inner products or quadratic functions that you could hope to do with your techniques?
Okay. Actually, I haven't considered, general functional encryption yet, but actually we have finished, in this paper, we talked about the queuing needs, but in the following paper, which we haven't published yet, but in that paper, we have constructed needs in the URS model and also non-interactive ZAP. Yeah, and maybe I'm not sure whether more non-trivial primitives can be constructed in this world. That might be interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so I guess we can close the session if there's no more questions. And